The morning air was still cool when Frank Delaney stepped onto his front porch, coffee in hand. At 78 years old, his joints complained with every step, but his back still straightened the moment his eyes landed on the gleaming pole in the middle of his front yard. 15 feet of polished steel stood tall against the dawn sky. At the very top, folded neatly from the night before, was the flag that had carried him through battles half a century ago. Frank had ordered the flagpole online after weeks of thinking it over. It wasn't an impulse purchase, it was something he'd wanted for years. For him, the flag wasn't just fabric stitched with stars and stripes. It was the memory of friends who never came home from Korea, of standing in the mud while shells burst overhead, of the cold nights when he'd look up at the flag and remember what he was fighting for. And now, in this quiet suburban neighborhood, he wanted it to stand proud in front of his house, where every sunrise could catch it in red, white, and blue. That morning, as he slid the rope through the pulley and clipped the flag to its halyard, he thought of Jimmy Harris, the 19-year-old from Ohio who had saved Frank's life during an ambush. Jimmy never got to see 20. Frank whispered his name every time he raised the flag, a private salute to the fallen. The cloth unfurled, catching the wind, and in that moment Frank felt a rush of pride fill his chest. This was his home. His land. His flag. A neighbor walking her dog paused and smiled. "Looks beautiful, Frank," she said, shielding her eyes to watch it ripple. "Thank you, ma'am," Frank answered, voice low but steady. "It means the world to me." For the rest of the week, the flagpole became a small landmark on the street. Neighbors nodded approvingly, kids pointed at it, and Frank sat on his porch each evening just to watch the colors dance in the breeze. It gave him peace he hadn't felt in years. But peace, in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA, never lasted long. On the 7th day, an envelope appeared in Frank's mailbox. The paper was crisp, the logo of the Homeowners Association printed at the top in officious blue. He knew before opening it what it would say. He had seen the way Melissa Carpenter, head of the HOA board, slowed her SUV when driving past his yard, lips pursed like she had just bitten into a lemon. Frank tore the envelope open with a sigh. "Dear Mr. Delaney, it has come to our attention that you have erected a 15-foot flagpole in your front yard. According to HOA Covenant 4.3, all flags must be flown from a stanchion mounted to the home. You are hereby instructed to remove the flagpole within 10 days or face fines of $100 per day. Respectfully, the board." Frank read it twice, then laughed. A dry, humorless chuckle. Remove the pole? Not a chance in hell. He set the letter on his kitchen counter, poured himself another coffee, and went back outside to look at the flag. It fluttered against the clear sky, just as it had when he stood watch on faraway soil. He whispered, "Over my dead body." That evening, Melissa showed up. She was in her mid-50s, perfectly coiffed hair, and a clipboard clutched under her arm like a weapon. She marched up Frank's driveway as though she owned it. "Mr. Delaney," she began, lips tight. "I trust you've received our notice." Frank rocked slowly on his porch chair, giving her a measured look. "I got your letter." "Then you understand the flagpole must come down. Rules are rules. Every homeowner agreed when they moved here." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I didn't fight for this country just to be told by some paper pusher that I can't raise the flag on my own land." Melissa stiffened. "This isn't about patriotism, Mr. Delaney. It's about uniformity. Flagpoles disrupt the aesthetic standard of the neighborhood." Frank's eyes narrowed. "The only thing disrupted here is my patience. That pole stays." Melissa scribbled something on her clipboard. "You'll regret this. The fines will begin tomorrow." She spun on her heel and stormed off. Frank watched her leave, jaw clenched, but when he turned his gaze back to the flag, his expression softened. They could fine him, threaten him, curse his name, but they'd never take that pole down. Not while he was breathing. The next morning, Frank made a point of rising early. He polished the pole until it gleamed and raised the flag high. He stood at attention, hand over his heart, while the first rays of sunlight kissed the stripes. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some whispered that Frank was crazy for going against the HOA. Others quietly applauded him. One man across the street, a Vietnam vet, gave him a salute as he passed by. Melissa, however, drove by 3 times that day, her SUV idling near his driveway. On the third pass, Frank gave her a wave and the biggest grin he could muster. Her face went crimson as she sped off. By the week's end, another envelope arrived. This one thicker. Inside was a bill for $700 in fines. Frank didn't even bother reading the breakdown. He tore it in half, tossed it into the trash, and muttered, "Not a damn dime." That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table with an old photo album. Faded pictures of men in uniforms stared back at him. Some with arms slung around each other, others with rifles resting on their shoulders. He ran his finger across Jimmy's face, the boy who never made it home. He remembered the words Jimmy had whispered in the mud, bleeding out, "Promise me you'll never forget what we're fighting for." Frank closed the album and looked out the window at the flag, illuminated by a spotlight he'd installed at its base. His throat tightened. "I promised you, Jimmy," he whispered, "and I'm not about to break it now." The HOA could send all the letters they wanted. They could fine him, threaten him, even drag him to court. But Frank had already made his choice. The flag would stay. And he would fight for it, no matter the cost. The first letter had been irritating, but the second one made Frank laugh. He tossed the $700 bill in the trash without hesitation. He figured the HOA would huff and puff, then eventually give up. After all, who in their right mind fines a Korean War veteran for flying the American flag? But Frank underestimated the sheer pettiness of the HOA. On the 10th day, a new envelope appeared. This one was stamped in bold red ink, "Final warning." Frank opened it at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee. "Dear Mr. Delaney, despite multiple notices, you have failed to comply with HOA Covenant 4.3. Your fines now total $1,500. Failure to pay within 7 days will result in a lien being placed on your property. Additional legal action may follow." The board. Frank set the letter down slowly. A lien on his home? His home, which he'd paid off 20 years ago. His home, bought with money he'd earned by working 12-hour shifts at the steel mill after serving his country? He felt his blood pressure spike. The arrogance of it. They thought they could bully him into submission, like he was some young kid who didn't know any better. He marched straight to the trash can and tore the letter into confetti. Word of the Flagpole fight spread quickly. In a neighborhood like Maple Grove, gossip traveled faster than wildfire. Some neighbors supported Frank. The Vietnam veteran across the street, Mr. Bradley, told him, "You keep that flag flying, Frank. I'll stand with you." Others whispered disapproval. A younger couple down the road muttered about property values and how Frank was making trouble. Melissa, the HOA president, stoked the division, telling anyone who would listen that Frank was destroying the community's integrity. Frank ignored the whispers. Every morning he raised his flag at sunrise. Every evening he lowered it at dusk. The ritual grounded him. But he couldn't ignore the tightening knot in his stomach every time he saw Melissa's SUV creeping past, clipboard in hand. One evening, just as Frank was finishing his supper, a sharp knock rattled his front door. He opened it to find 2 HOA board members standing stiffly on his porch, Melissa in the middle, arms crossed. "Mr. Delaney," Melissa began, voice icy, "we've been more than patient. You're in clear violation of the covenants you agreed to when you bought this property. If you don't remove the flagpole immediately, we will take legal action." Frank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Lady, when I signed those papers 40 years ago, I didn't sign away my right to honor my country." One of the board members, a nervous-looking man in glasses, cleared his throat. "We're not saying you can't fly the flag, sir. Just do it from a stanchion on your house, like everyone else." Frank's eyes blazed. "The men I buried overseas didn't die for a stanchion. They died for that flag flying free and proud. You got a problem with it? That's your burden, not mine." Melissa's jaw tightened. "We'll see what the court has to say." She spun on her heel and stormed off the porch, the others scrambling after her. Frank closed the door with a grunt. His dog, Max, padded over and laid his head against Frank's leg. Frank scratched behind his ears. "Don't you worry, boy. They ain't taking that pole down. Not today, not ever. The next week was hell. Every day, another letter arrived. The fines climbed higher, $3,000, then $5,000. Threats of foreclosure. Warnings of lawsuits. Each envelope was thicker than the last, packed with legal jargon meant to intimidate. Frank stopped opening them. Straight into the trash they went. Then came the harassment. Anonymous complaints about his lawn being 2 inches too long. Notices about unauthorized decorations because he had hung a small wooden eagle on his porch. Even a warning about his garbage can be visible from the street. It was clear, the HOA had declared war. Frank felt the weight pressing down on him. He was old, his body ached, and the stress gnawed at his health. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they could really take his house. But each morning when he stepped outside and raised that flag, resolve flooded back into his veins. The fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran, every family, every homeowner who'd been pushed around by people drunk on power. One afternoon, Mr. Bradley came over, lowering his voice like he was sharing classified intel. "Frank, I overheard Melissa at the HOA meeting. They're serious about court. They want to make an example out of you." Frank chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Then they picked the wrong damn example. Bradley clapped him on the shoulder. "I've got your back, brother. Whatever you need." Frank nodded. The solidarity meant more than words could say. The final straw came when Frank received a notice not by mail, but hand-delivered by a process server. Summons to appear in county court, it read. The HOA was suing him for covenant violations, unpaid fines, and damage to community cohesion. Frank's hands shook as he read the words. Not from fear, no, he'd faced worse, but from fury. They wanted to drag an old soldier into court for flying the very flag he'd fought under. That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table with the summons in front of him. He thought of Jimmy again, of the promise he'd made in the mud all those years ago. He thought of the thousands who had bled beneath that flag. And he made his decision. He wasn't going to roll over. He wasn't going to pay a dime. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Frank had faced bullets, grenades, and nights so cold he thought his bones would crack. But he never thought he'd be staring down a lawsuit over a flagpole. The summons sat on his kitchen table for 2 days before he picked up the phone and called a lawyer. He didn't know much about law, just enough to know he'd need help. The HOA's letters were full of legal jargon, words meant to confuse and intimidate. Frank wasn't about to walk into a courtroom unarmed. The lawyer's name was Daniel Murphy. A young man, mid-30s, with a firm handshake and a calm voice. His father had served in Vietnam, and when Frank told him the story, Daniel leaned forward with fire in his eyes. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every homeowner they've ever bullied. They think you'll back down because you're one man. But if you're willing to fight, I'll stand with you." Frank nodded. "They want to make an example out of me. Fine. Let's give them an example they'll never forget." Daniel began digging into the HOA's covenants and bylaws. What he found made Frank's blood boil. The HOA had a long history of bullying residents, fines for minor landscaping issues, threats over mailbox paint colors, even a lawsuit against a widow who had installed a ramp for her disabled husband. They thrived on intimidation, counting on most people to give in before things reached court. But Frank wasn't most people. At Daniel's urging, Frank began keeping meticulous records. Every letter, every fine, every photo of his flagpole was organized into a binder. Daniel also discovered something crucial. Federal law protected the right to fly the American flag. While HOAs could set reasonable rules about placement, they couldn't outright ban flagpoles without good cause. "They're overstepping," Daniel said, tapping the statute. "And judges don't like bullies." Meanwhile, the HOA grew bolder. Melissa strutted through the neighborhood like a queen, telling neighbors Frank was about to lose his house. One afternoon, as Frank was watering his roses, Melissa slowed her SUV to a crawl and rolled down the window. "Enjoy that flag while you can," she sneered. "Next month it'll be gone. Court always sides with the HOA." Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lady, I've seen dictators fall. You don't scare me. Her face turned red before she sped off. At night, though, doubts crept in. Frank wasn't a young soldier anymore. His back ached, his heart sometimes skipped beats. The thought of losing his home gnawed at him. Could they really take it? Would a judge care about an old man's principles? He found himself pacing the living room, staring at the summons. For a moment, he considered pulling the pole down, just to end it all. But then he'd glance out the window at the flag illuminated against the dark sky. The stars and stripes snapped proudly in the wind. And he remembered Jimmy's dying words, "Promise me you'll never forget what we're fighting for." Frank clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to break that promise now. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. Daniel drove Frank to the courthouse, his binder of evidence on the seat between them. Inside, Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table with a smug grin, flanked by two attorneys in sharp suits. She didn't even glance at Frank. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, called the case. The HOA lawyers argued that Frank was in clear violation of Covenant 4.3 and that his refusal to comply was damaging the cohesion of the community. Frank sat silently, fists clenched under the table, until it was Daniel's turn. "Your Honor," Daniel began, "this is not about cohesion. It's about control. My client, a decorated Korean War veteran, erected a flagpole on his property to honor the country he fought for. Federal law protects his right to display the American flag. The HOA's attempt to strip him of that right is not only unlawful, it's un-American." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. She ordered both parties to submit additional briefs and set a trial date for the following month. As they left the courtroom, Melissa hissed, "This isn't over, old man. You'll lose everything." Frank turned slowly, his voice low and steady. "Lady, the only thing I'm losing is patience." The news spread fast. Some neighbors rallied to Frank's side, leaving small flags planted in his yard overnight. Others stayed silent, afraid of crossing the HOA. Then, one morning, Frank opened his front door to find a folded note tucked under his welcome mat. It read, "Thank you for standing up to them. They've been bullying us for years. We're with you." No signature. Just courage whispered from the shadows. Frank smiled. Maybe he wasn't fighting alone after all. The weeks before trial were tense. More letters from the HOA arrived, their tone increasingly hostile. Frank ignored them all. Instead, he focused on his morning ritual. Each dawn, he raised the flag while humming the old army cadence under his breath. Each evening, he lowered it with solemn care. Neighbors often paused to watch, some even saluting with him. It became more than defiance. It became a symbol. And though Frank's body was tired, his spirit burned brighter each day. He wasn't just fighting for his own flagpole anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by people like Melissa. The trial loomed ahead, heavy as a thundercloud. But Frank was ready. He had survived war. He could survive this. The trial was still weeks away, but Frank's fight was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. The story of one old veteran against the HOA was about to spill far beyond Maple Grove's quiet streets. It started with a knock. Frank opened his door to find a young woman in a navy blazer holding a notepad. "Mr. Delaney?" she asked politely. "My name's Sarah. I'm with the Maple Grove Gazette. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions about your flagpole dispute?" Frank hesitated. He wasn't one for reporters. But Sarah's expression was earnest, not pushy. And maybe, just maybe, if the truth came out, the HOA would finally back off. He waved her inside. They sat at his kitchen table, and Frank told her everything. The letters, the fines, the threats of liens. He spoke about Jimmy, about the promise he'd made in the mud all those years ago. His voice cracked when he said, "I'm not fighting for a pole. I'm fighting for the right to honor the flag my brothers died under." Sarah scribbled notes furiously. "This is powerful. Do you mind if I take a photo of you with the flagpole?" Frank led her outside, straight-backed despite the ache in his spine. He raised the flag while she snapped photos, the morning light catching the stars and stripes as they unfurled. By the next day, the headline blared across the local paper. "Veteran faces HOA lawsuit for flying American flag." The effect was immediate. Neighbors stopped Frank at the grocery store, clapping him on the back. Cars honked in support as they drove past his house. A retired Marine left a case of beer on Frank's porch with a note, "Semper Fi, brother. Don't let him win." Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Melissa and her board seethed. At the next HOA meeting, she ranted about traitors leaking confidential information and swore they would not be made fools of. But the damage was done. The HOA wasn't just fighting Frank anymore, they were fighting public opinion. 2 days later, a news van rolled up to Frank's house. A cameraman set up his tripod while a smiling anchor adjusted her microphone. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "we'd love to hear your side of the story. People across the county are outraged that a veteran is being targeted for flying the flag." Frank stood tall beside his flagpole as the camera rolled. "I didn't ask for this fight," he said plainly. "But I'll be damned if I let anyone tell me I can't honor the flag of the country I served. That flag stands for freedom, and freedom doesn't come with HOA permission slips." The clip aired that evening. Within hours, it spread across social media. Thousands of comments poured in. "Stand strong, sir. We're with you. This HOA should be ashamed. What kind of people go after a veteran? Let's all fly our flags for Frank." By the end of the week, homes across Maple Grove sprouted flags. On porches, in windows, even taped to mailboxes. Melissa drove through the neighborhood fuming as stars and stripes lined the streets like a parade route. Melissa wasn't about to back down. The HOA released a statement to the press, dripping with smug professionalism. "We support patriotism and the right to fly the American flag. However, Mr. Delaney's 15-foot flagpole violates community standards agreed upon by all homeowners. Rules exist to preserve harmony. Exceptions cannot be made for individuals who believe themselves above the law." The statement backfired. Letters to the editor flooded the local paper. Radio hosts mocked the HOA on air, one saying, "Preserve harmony? How about preserving common sense?" Melissa doubled down, hiring a PR firm to restore the HOA's image. But every move only made them look more out of touch. Then came the letters. Bundles of envelopes began arriving at Frank's door. Notes from veterans across the country. Some short, some long, all heartfelt. "I fought in Desert Storm. Fly it high, brother. They tried the same thing to me. Thank you for standing tall. My husband never came home from Vietnam. Please don't let them take your flag down." One letter came from a schoolteacher in Ohio. Her class had seen the news and drawn pictures of the American flag, each child writing, "Thank you, Mr. Delaney," at the bottom. Frank spread the letters across his kitchen table, tears stinging his eyes. He hadn't expected support from strangers. But now he knew this wasn't just his fight. He was carrying the hopes of thousands. The pressure wore on Melissa. Neighbors stopped waving when she drove past. Someone graffitied "Flag Hater" on her garage door in chalk. Anonymous packages of American flags showed up on her porch. At the next HOA meeting, attendance overflowed. Residents demanded answers. "Why are we spending our dues on lawyers just to bully an old man?" one shouted. Melissa snapped. "He broke the rules. If we let him get away with it, what's next? Pink houses? Junk cars in driveways? Chaos." But the crowd wasn't convinced. Murmurs of rebellion rippled through the room. For the first time, Melissa realized control was slipping from her hands. The trial date drew closer. Reporters promised full coverage. The courthouse braced for crowds. Frank tried to keep calm, but even he couldn't ignore the weight of what was coming. The night before the trial, he stood in his yard, gazing up at the flag. The fabric glowed under the spotlight, each stripe rippling like a heartbeat. He whispered the names of the men he'd lost overseas, one by one. "Jimmy, Harris, Coleman, Davis. This one's for you." Max, his loyal dog, sat at his feet, ears twitching in the breeze. Frank raised his hand in a final salute. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The morning of the trial dawned cold and gray. Frank stood in front of his bathroom mirror, buttoning his only suit. The jacket was a little tight around his shoulders, but the metals pinned to the lapel still gleamed. He wasn't dressing for the HOA. He was dressing for his brothers in arms, for the promise he had carried for decades. When he stepped outside, he froze. A crowd had gathered at the curb. Veterans in uniform. Neighbors waving flags. Children holding signs that read, "Let Frank fly his flag," and "He equals hands off America." Frank swallowed hard. "I don't deserve this," he muttered. A retired Marine clapped him on the back. "Yes, you do, brother. Let's go win this." The courtroom was packed, so full that security had to turn people away. Reporters filled the front rows, cameras flashing. At the plaintiff's table sat Melissa, stiff as a board, flanked by two expensive lawyers. She wore a navy blazer with a pearl necklace, but no amount of polish could hide the smug curl of her lips. At the defense table, Frank sat with his attorney, a young but sharp veteran named Daniel Ruiz. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, banged her gavel. Court is now in session. Case 4821, Maple Grove HOA versus Frank Delaney. Melissa's lawyer sprang up first. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Mr. Delaney installed a 15-foot flagpole in violation of Maple Grove's community standards. He signed an agreement when he purchased his home, agreeing to abide by those standards. The HOA is merely enforcing the rules that protect the integrity of the neighborhood." He gestured toward Frank with theatrical disdain. "No one is above the law, not even a veteran." The audience hissed. The judge slammed her gavel again. "Order." Now it was Daniel's turn. He rose calmly, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, we don't dispute that Mr. Delaney installed a flagpole. What we dispute is the morality and legality of punishing him for exercising his right to fly the American flag. Congress passed the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act in 2005. It explicitly prevents homeowners associations from prohibiting residents from displaying the United States flag on their property." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The lawyer dropped a folder of documents on the judge's bench. "This isn't about neighborhood harmony. This is about harassment. The HOA singled out a Korean War veteran and threatened fines, liens, and humiliation, all because he chose a freestanding pole instead of a bracket. That's not integrity. That's cruelty." Frank stood when his lawyer motioned. His knees ached, but his voice was steady. "I buried brothers under that flag, Your Honor. I fought so people could live free, so they could raise that flag in peace. If the HOA thinks I'll tear it down for their convenience, they're mistaken." The room erupted in applause until the judge called for silence again. But even she couldn't hide the glint of respect in her eyes. Melissa's lawyer smirked. "Mr. Delaney, is it true you signed the HOA contract when you moved in?" "Yes." "And is it true the contract forbid structures, including flagpoles, over 6 feet tall without approval?" "Yes," Frank admitted. The lawyer pounced. "So you knowingly broke the rules?" Frank leaned forward. "I knowingly followed the law of the land. Your rules don't trump federal law. And they sure as hell don't trump my promise to the men I served with." The crowd roared again. The judge allowed it this time. Melissa's lawyer sputtered, but his points were unraveling. The HOA looked less like guardians of order and more like schoolyard bullies. At last, Melissa herself was called to testify. She walked stiffly to the stand, chin high. "Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel began, "why did the HOA take such aggressive measures against Mr. Delaney?" Melissa sniffed. "Because rules are rules. If we let him get away with this, the neighborhood falls apart. Next thing you know, people will have chickens in their yards, rusted cars on their lawns, Christmas lights up in July." "So your problem isn't with the flag," Daniel cut in. "It's with control." "That's absurd," she snapped. "We support the flag. But we cannot allow chaos." Daniel smiled coldly. "Chaos? You call a single flagpole chaos? Or is the real chaos what you created, sending fines, threatening liens, even hiring a PR firm to smear a veteran in the press?" Melissa's face flushed red. "He broke the rules. He thinks he's special just because he—" The judge cut her off. "That's enough, Mrs. Whitmore." The trial stretched into the afternoon. Finally, the judge returned from chambers, papers in hand. The room held its breath. Having reviewed the evidence, it is clear that the Maple Grove HOA acted beyond its authority. Federal law protects the right of citizens to display the American flag on residential property. While HOAs may impose reasonable restrictions on time, place, or manner, their actions in this case were punitive, discriminatory, and unjust. She looked straight at Melissa. This court rules in favor of Mr. Frank Delaney. The HOA is ordered to cease all fines and threats. Furthermore, the HOA will pay Mr. Delaney's legal fees. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The room exploded in cheers. Veterans saluted. Neighbors hugged one another. Frank lowered his head, overwhelmed, before Daniel gripped his shoulder. "You won, Frank. You really won." Melissa sat frozen, her perfect posture crumbling as whispers of "resign" rippled through the crowd behind her. When Frank stepped outside, reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed, microphones extended. "Mr. Delaney, how do you feel?" Frank raised a hand. The crowd fell silent. "I didn't fight this battle for me. I fought it for every veteran who's been told they don't matter anymore. I fought it for every neighbor tired of bullies hiding behind rules. And I fought it for the flag, because that flag belongs to all of us. Not the HOA. Not anyone. Us." He saluted as the crowd broke into chants of USA. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt at peace. The courthouse victory echoed far beyond Maple Grove. Within hours of the ruling, Frank's story was on every major news network. Photos of him saluting outside the courthouse, medals on his chest, went viral. Headlines blared. Veteran defeats HOA over Flagpole battle. Korean War hero stands tall for old glory. For a man who had lived quietly for years, Frank suddenly found himself the symbol of something much larger. Veterans from across the country sent him letters. Families mailed photos of their own flagpoles, inspired to raise them higher than ever. Even strangers left notes at his door. "Thank you for reminding us what the flag means." Back in Maple Grove, things shifted quickly. Melissa, the once feared HOA president, could barely show her face. Where neighbors once lowered their heads when she walked by, they now whispered behind her back. At the next HOA board meeting, the turnout was larger than anyone had ever seen. Dozens of homeowners crammed into the clubhouse, many of them wearing pins or shirts with the flag. One man stood up. "We didn't elect you to bully people. We elected you to protect our community. And all you've done is bring us shame." Others nodded, clapping. The motion to remove Melissa passed almost unanimously. By the end of the week, she had resigned in disgrace, her name permanently tainted in Maple Grove. In her place, the community elected a new board, a mix of veterans, retirees, and longtime residents who promised to prioritize fairness over control. The first rule they changed? Flag displays. From then on, any resident could fly the flag however they wished, as long as it was respectful. Despite the sudden fame, Frank never let it swell his pride. He still took his morning walks, still sat on his porch in the evenings, still talked to the neighbors' kids about fishing and baseball. The only difference was the way people looked at him now, with gratitude, with respect. The flagpole remained where it was, gleaming in the sun. Every morning, Frank would step outside, raise the stars and stripes, and salute. Neighbors often joined him, sometimes with hands on hearts, sometimes with quiet tears in their eyes. One Sunday morning, a little boy from down the street tugged at Frank's sleeve. "Mr. Delaney? Can I help raise the flag today?" Frank knelt, handing him the rope. "Of course, son. But remember, when you do this, you're not just raising fabric. You're raising every story, every sacrifice, every promise this flag carries." The boy nodded solemnly, and together they lifted the flag into the sky. Melissa moved away within months. Rumor had it she tried to join another HOA board in a nearby county, but her reputation followed her. Wherever she went, people whispered about the woman who tried to take down a veteran and lost. For Frank, though, Melissa was already forgotten. He bore no grudge. He had faced far fiercer enemies in his lifetime. She was just another obstacle, one that had been swept aside by truth. Frank's case didn't just end in victory for him, it sparked change elsewhere. Inspired homeowners began challenging their own HOAs across the country. If Frank can win, they said, why can't we? News outlets revisited the 2005 Flag Act, reminding Americans that no HOA could override federal law. Frank's name appeared in legal newsletters, veterans publications, and community blogs. He had become a symbol, a reminder that even one determined man could push back against an institution. One evening, months after the trial, Frank sat on his porch with Daniel, his young lawyer. The flag rippled in the evening breeze, painted gold by the setting sun. You know, Daniel said, you didn't just win a case. You changed people's hearts. That doesn't happen often. Frank chuckled softly. I didn't set out to change hearts. I just wanted to keep my flag. He sipped his coffee, gazing at the sky where the flag swayed proudly. But maybe that's how change works. One person, one fight, one stand at a time. Daniel nodded. Think you'd do it again? Frank didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat. Because some things are worth standing tall for. Years later, long after Frank was gone, Maple Grove still carried the memory of the Flagpole battle. Neighbors would tell newcomers the story of the Korean War veteran who took on the HOA and won. Children who had grown up watching Frank salute the flag now raised their own flags with the same respect. And in the center of the neighborhood, Frank's old house still stood, its flagpole still rising proudly against the sky. Because some victories don't fade. They ripple through generations. And Frank Delaney's victory was one of them.